Happy New Year, good people.
Oh my god!
I hope you all have an awesome year ahead of you, and do you know what would make 2024 just a bit sweeter? More Resident Evil, right? These last few years have been solid for Resident Evil, and it appears that 2024 will be no exception. While it is currently unknown and rather unlikely that there will be another big Resident Evil game releasing this year, there will likely be announcements from Capcom regarding the next games in the franchise. Here they are. Let's first begin by looking at a new Gold Edition that is likely to be releasing earlier this year. February, in fact, if the leaks are to be believed, because many sources are pointing at a Resident Evil 4 Remake Gold Edition launching on February 9th for the PS4 and PS5. This page was recently spotted over on Metacritic, and while just the PS4 and PS5 versions are listed here, the game will almost certainly be available on Xbox Series X and S and PC platforms. Again, take this with a grain of salt, because Capcom has not come out and confirmed that this edition of the game will be launching at this time, but seeing as Capcom loves releasing gold editions for their Resident Evil games, it is absolutely likely that a gold edition for Resident Evil 4 Remake is likely to launch sometime this year. Just like every gold edition ever for the last half dozen Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 4 Remake Gold Edition will likely include every piece of content that was made available for Resident Evil 4 Remake, so expect the Deluxe Edition DLC, Ada's Separate Ways campaign, and everything else that was made available for the existing versions. Because this version may be releasing sometime soon, any hopes for an additional campaign starring a much requested Luis Serra side chapter or a Jack Krauser Operation Javier chapter may be out of the question. Ada's Separate Ways DLC released a few months back in September of last year, but with a gold edition perhaps coming several months after the previous DLC, some are wondering if we'll get even more content with a gold edition release. I know a lot of players have been asking for an unlock all option for Resident Evil 4 Remake, including getting the cat ears without earning it through just playing the game, so who knows, perhaps Capcom will include it in this upcoming edition. But yeah, this is just more Resident Evil 4 Remake, and we know this game has sold incredibly well so far and will likely continue to print money for Capcom well into the future. I'm just curious, even with a Resident Evil 4 Remake Gold Edition, and maybe if it contains new content, are you tired of Resident Evil 4 Remake yet? Are you ready to move on to the next Resident Evil? We'll touch up on that more in just a second. Just like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 Gold Editions that came before it, players are likely going to be able to upgrade their base digital versions of the game to get the Gold Edition at a lower cost. Pricing has yet to be decided, but these editions often release at a lower price than when they initially launched. With that said, what do you think will be included in the Resident Evil 4 Remake Gold Edition? And for those who haven't played the remake yet, are you interested in picking this edition up? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What comes next from Capcom are yet more announcements for other unannounced projects, and these projects are likely one of two different games, one being a continuation of the franchise in Resident Evil 9, and the other being another remake of one of the older Resident Evil titles. I went into that greatly in my previous video, linked in the description and at the end of this video. But first, let's explore what comes next for the franchise in Resident Evil 9. In 2017's Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and in 2021's Resident Evil Village, we got two games featuring Ethan Winters as the protagonist in a first-person format. You would think that the 4-year gap between those two games would make it so that 4 years after Resident Evil Village would come Resident Evil 9 launching in 2025, and you may not be wrong about that. Capcom likes to publish their debut trailers for their upcoming Resident Evil projects in the summer or fall before the games were to launch, which would mean that we are likely to see a Resident Evil 9 trailer land sometime in the summer or fall of 2024 before an expected winter or spring release for Resident Evil 9. We saw Resident Evil 7 release in the winter of 2017, with Resident Evil Village release in spring of 2021, so I would imagine something quite similar would happen regarding a possible 2025 launch for Resident Evil 9. Perhaps the biggest question would be, what the heck would Resident Evil 9 be about? Here's where we are going to get into a tiny bit of spoiler territory for those who haven't played Village yet, so skip to this timestamp to steer clear of the story spoilers for what we may come to expect in Resident Evil 9. So, Our poor Ethan Winters passed away at the end of Resident Evil Village, and much of the loss of Ethan Winters was explored in the DLC chapter Shadow of Rose, starring Ethan's daughter, Rose. A teenager, and having jumped the timeline of the series from 2021 up to 2037, we can surmise that perhaps Resident Evil 9 could follow up with Rose, as her Shadow of Rose DLC transformed a Rose who otherwise despised her unusual superhuman qualities into a more confident, yet still growing young woman who has come to terms with her powers and the loss of her father. The DLC eloquently lays the foundation for a future installment, perhaps Resident Evil 9, continuing the Winters story but with Rose as the primary protagonist. Let me know what you think an RE9 with Rose would look like in the comments below, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see Resident Evil 9 be the final game in the Winters saga. Resident Evils 1 through 3 established this series with classic Resident Evil characters and its iconic fixed camera perspectives and tank controls, with a very deliberate focus on survival horror, while Resident Evils 4 through 6 took on an over-the-shoulder perspective and leaned on the action-heavy qualities of Resident Evil with a solid mix of both new and old Resident Evil characters. Resident Evil 7 and 8 are very much outliers in that the game introduced an almost completely new cast of protagonists and villains and introduced a first-person perspective. While the Shadow of Rose DLC did sport a third-person perspective, I wouldn't be surprised to see this 9th installment continue the first-person perspective, which, as a fan of VR, would make it a clear candidate to get the VR treatment that the previous games received on PSVR 1 and 2. Other rumors surrounding Resident Evil 9 point at the title being called Resident Evil Apocalypse, and that the plot would be based around the 9th moon phase. These leaks are suggesting that the game will take place in a ghost town in the western United States, with players facing off against grotesque and deformed creatures. There's not much else that we know of regarding a supposed Resident Evil Apocalypse, or even if that's even legit, but these two avenues certainly do sound like something Capcom may be working on. We know Chris Redfield is deeply connected to the events of Resident Evil 7 and 8, and part of the Houndwolf squad, so perhaps Resident Evil 9 surrounding Chris Redfield may be the avenue of choice for Capcom. Yeah, that was an insane amount of speculation just now, but do me a solid and let me know what you think Resident Evil 9 is going to be like in the comments below, and make sure to shoot me a like and subscribe to the channel for more Resident Evil coverage going forward. We also cannot deny the possibility that we may hear of the next Resident Evil remake that Capcom has confirmed to be working on. We don't know how far into development this remake is in, or if they have even started working on one yet, but we do have the confirmation from Capcom that there will indeed be more remakes coming out in the future. A Resident Evil 5 remake makes sense from the chronological standpoint, since the last several games from Resident Evil 2 up to Resident Evil 4 have been remade. But that dismisses all the character development of Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker before the 5th Resident Evil game, which sports some very pivotal moments for especially Wesker. So I'm banking on a remake of the older games, namely anything from Resident Evil 0 to another Resident Evil 1 remake, and a Code Veronica remake to be considered here. Although I believe we will be getting an announcement for Resident Evil 9 this year, along with its release next year in 2025, I wouldn't be surprised to maybe get a teaser trailer from Capcom disclosing the next Resident Evil remake. 2026 is a very important year for Resident Evil, because that year marks the 30th anniversary of Resident Evil, making me believe that a remake of a classic RE title could very likely drop that year. A teaser in 2024 for that game, anyone? I don't think it's that unlikely. Of course, let me know your thoughts regarding the next Resident Evil remake in the comments, and absolutely take a look at this video I did surrounding the most likely Resident Evil games we may see remade next. With the 30th anniversary of the franchise just around the corner, we're definitely in for a hefty wave of nostalgia. Be sure to stay tuned to the channel for more Resident Evil content and updates, and I look forward to seeing you all real soon in the next one.